Hi, friends. This is Sir Aaron from Urban Spirituality, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit more about the theory of post-traumatic slave master syndrome. This time, I am going a little bit more in depth about the brain and how it influences this phenomenon. I will also be providing some insight into this process of understanding this using current events. So let's get started. So first, before we get started, it's important that we construct some shared meaning and understanding about the terminology and language that I'm using. First, let's talk about trauma. So trauma is a circumstances in which an event overwhelms or exceeds a person's capacity to protect his or her psychic well-being and integrity. It's a collision between an event and a person's resources where the power of the event is greater than the resource available for effective response and recovery. So what does this mean? Let's say you are walking through a dark alley and you were beat really bad. What ideas might you have about this dark alley? What might your fears be telling you about this dark alley? The next time you walk past this dark alley, how might your body feel? What might you think about? You might think about the past experiences of being in a dark alley. Now, let's say you have children. What might you teach your children about that dark alley? Maybe the alley is unsafe. Stay away from dark alleys. Alleys are a dangerous place to be. So, if we want to build on that idea, it is not the traumatic event, it is how the person experienced the traumatic event that causes trauma. So, with that being said, it's important to understand that trauma is not a universal experience. Also, although there might be some general patterns according to certain groups, it's not identical. Two people can walk in your office who have been sexually abused or sexually touched in a way that, for one, it was traumatic, and for the other, it's not. You can't compare traumatic experiences. However, you can use them as information, just as a way to understand the overall trends and patterns. So going back to the intergenerational processes of trauma, thinking about how our dark alley example, you inform your children now of how to approach and interact with dark alleys based on your own traumatic experiences. So now let's move forward to the next term that I would like to share with you all and hope that we can develop some shared meaning around. This idea of historical trauma. So, historical trauma is a collective emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations originating from massive group trauma. So, what does this mean? This means that groups do experience massive group trauma and it influences how a family organizes over time. We see this in Native American communities. We see this in Latino communities. We see this in African American communities. And so, if we look back on historical trauma, in other words, intergenerational patterns of trauma based off race, we can see how certain symptoms are manifesting as a community at large. One thing that is limiting in the research is that this is only applied to minority populations, populations who have experiences some sort of oppression. So, how we build on this topic is that we are also applying it to white individuals and white development. So, moving forward, post traumatic slave master syndrome to us is a metaphor used to describe our perceptions of how slavery influenced white Americans and still has residual effects on their collective perceptions of themselves and those who are different than them. So all of this shared meaning will really help us situate ourselves in relationship to the context of brain development and how trauma influence how the brain organizes. So before we get into it, I do have to be humbled and pay much thanks to Dr. Dave Ziegler, Executive Director of the Child Trauma Center here in Springfield, Oregon, called Jasper Mountain. Without his mentorship and speaking to me in depth about the concept of neurological reparative therapy, I would not have been able to launch into understanding historical trauma from a similar lens. Um, this is the book in which is one of my roadmaps to understanding healing. And so I would offer this to you as well. I will not go into much detail about the NRT approach. However, the purpose of this talk now is to just describe post-traumatic slave master syndrome in the context of trauma and brain development. Dave, I appreciate your guidance, and I appreciate all of the work that you have done with the children at Jasper Mountain and the environment and family that you have developed there. That is my home away from home. So when we think about the brain and we think about individuals in their brain, we want to think about it in terms of perceptual processing systems. So how someone perceives information in their environment and how the brain then organizes that information for behavioral responses. So when we think about that, we want to look at brain development, perceptual processing systems on a continuum, where on one side it's an automatic process and the other it's complex processing. Smack dab in the middle is what we call protective processing. That is a combination of thinking and automatic responses. And so when we think about it in brain terms, there are three structures of the brain, and I'm going to say it now. I am going to be very surfacey and not as in depth as I could be in relationship to this topic. But there are three structures of the brain in which I am most interested in when thinking about how white people experience trauma and how that perpetuates racism today. This is the brainstem, the limbic system, and the frontal cortex, specifically the orbital prefrontal cortex. So the brainstem is responsible for body temperature, heart rate, and respiration. That is that automatic brain body systems that needs to function and regulate. Oftentimes this is happening out of our awareness. The protective processing system, which is the limbic system, it's responsible for our fight, flight. That is that instinctive need of protection. Fight, flight. If I'm in danger, I need to run or I need to fight against it. The more complex processing system is the orbital prefrontal cortex. It is what I like to call the relationship brain and is what is commonly known as the relationship brain in other texts as well. But this part of the brain is responsible for regulation of the body systems, attuned communication, emotional regulation, response flexibility, insight, modulation of fear, intuition, and morality. So this brain, it helps us stay in connection with others. Spiritually speaking, my understanding of the limbic system is where the ego sits, where that internal need for self-protection sits, and the prefrontal cortex is more where the compassion, the connect, and the relationship with others reside as well. So, what does that look like? When you are processing when you are processing information primarily from the limbic system, you are stuck in a trauma response cycle. So trauma is brought in from the brain into the internal system. The limbic system picks it up, triggers the automatic nervous system to become hypervigilant and aware in order to protect, and then goes out into the behavioral environment and have some sort of trauma-related behavioral response. What does this mean? It might be defensiveness, it might be overt racism, it might be sometimes microaggressions, various things of that sort, which further perpetuates the divide between groups. Next one is our healing response cycle. So the traumatic stimuli of the environment is interpreted by the brain. It's still fed through the limbic system. The automatic nervous system is also activated. However, the additional step is that now it's filtered through the orbital prefrontal cortex. That then allows a person to have better flexibility in their thinking, and better able to hold space and compassion for others. So I like to call this the connection building center of the brain, which allows you to stay in relationship to someone while also regulating your own internal emotional state. So this is a very confusing and complex diagram, but it's to show you that both of these systems are often operating simultaneously. However, as we work to grow spiritually, we begin to differentiate the two, and then we're able to better function in connection building. So, We offer clients things like mindfulness practices, meditation, trauma-informed guided meditation around racial issues. This helps them better differentiate and connect resources to their trauma so that they can stay and build connections with others. So let's put this in the context of post-traumatic slave master syndrome. Recent current event that happens that really help us speak to it is the Procter and Gamble video on The Talk, where black parents was talking to their children about how to be in America. I'm not going to play the video now. Here's the link to it. Here's the Procter Gamble website. Feel free to explore it on your own. I will also post it, the links here on the bio, and also on the blog of urbanspirituality.com. So what happened was one of my mentors always informed me that when you're watching these videos, it's best to listen and read the comments because you get a better idea of the divisions within society. And so, guess what? That's what I did to help us understand this dilemma. So I looked through the comments section and said, what might be symptoms of post-traumatic slave syndrome and how might they show up in these comment sections? And so gleaming off the screen was this response right here. So person one says, should the talk start out with the question, where is my daddy? To me, that was very triggering. So I was wondering how triggering was this video for this person, for him to say such a racist, division, anger intensifying statement like that. As I become curious, as I begin to regulate my own internal systems, I begin to think about things like, this guy must be really in pain. This guy cannot accept the reality that he is racist, and I am compassionate. And therefore, when he offers his insight, it comes off from the limbic region and not necessarily from higher executive functioning. Now, he wasn't straight overtly racist, so that tells me there is some capacity for higher executive functioning. However, as he become intentional, developing his awareness of his own trauma, he might become more flexible. What interests me also about the post is the response of person two. The response would be, have you ever heard of Nixon's war on drugs? Very insightful, very powerful, very strong individual to stand up in the face of racism. So I don't want to invalidate her response or whoever this response is. I believe it was a female and whatnot. But I do not want to invalidate her response. However, I want to name how her response could further divide this interaction. So he was interacting from his limbic system, and to me, she was also interacting from her limbic system. They had a limbic to limbic interaction, and because this limbic to limbic interaction, they both were in either fight or flight with one another and never had an opportunity to build that connection, to have shared empathy and shared understanding. So, what does this mean in brain terms? How is this situated with post-traumatic slave master syndrome? And how can we look at this individual's response in the context of trauma? So, what we do is, right, so in this video, when this guy, I'm assuming, watched this video, there was some environmental stressors and triggers that occurred. So the brain had interpreted the video in such a way where, I'm sorry, my marker isn't working. That's unfortunate. Oh, there we go. So our individual in this post, he interpreted the information in such a way that it went into his limbic system. His automatic nervous system was triggered back up to his brain and then reacted in a way like that. So if that's the case, that's a limbic interaction that happened, which further perpetuates the divide. So how do we help regulate that piece? And how do we develop an ability to go more from a healing response cycle than a trauma response cycle? We activate the orbital prefrontal cortex. What would it look like to help this individual better be able to connect with people through the prefrontal cortex? What we'll do is we'll practice mindfulness, we will do guided meditation, we'll do all kind of things to help cultivate this center, peaceful and calmness around their own historical trauma. However, the dominant discourse do not often shine a light on the experiences of white trauma and racism. It invalidates it and it tells them you have privilege and you have a better position in society, therefore you aren't relevant in this conversation. Well, that's only part of their identity. Just like we know as black people, there's only parts of our identity in which they categorize us into. And so if we know that we're complex creatures, even though we are traumatically divided up into all kind of sorts of chaos, could we not also hold that space for them? And as we hold compassion for them, as we hold love for them, they begin to already start activating their prefrontal cortex because we are not giving them information that reinforces the limbic system's need for protection. So what happens when someone like that approaches me? I'm constantly thinking, how can I help them activate their prefrontal cortex? Show them love, show them compassion, show them curiosity, and help understand their story so that you can validate their pain and therefore you do not reinforce the stigmatization of black people in which they have internalized. All that being said, this is what I hope that my interactions would do. The traumatic stimuli in the environment will be triggered. It will still go through the same limbic processes, brainstem. The difference is, though, now it's traveling through that orbital prefrontal cortex, which is our relational brain, right? The brain that helps us build connections and stay in relationship and have compassion and empathy for people. It goes there, back up, and then out, and we build connections. This process takes time and repetition. It didn't get ingrained overnight. And to have compassion and patience and understanding as we help those individuals who are the most racist, who are the most powerful, who are the top 1%, helping them activate their orbital prefrontal cortex in relationship to their own racist drama, or trauma drama rather, will help us all if we can just hold compassion for them. And so understanding the development of the brain of white people in relationship to their own racialized trauma stemming all the way back from slavery till now and their sense of invalidation, I can see why there's a sense of privilege and entitlement. I can see why those horrible symptoms in which we see in them manifest based off their own pain and their own inability to deal with their pain. For that place, I hold compassion. For that place, I hold love. For that place, I hold healing. Doesn't mean I have to agree with the manifestation of the trauma behavior, aka Trump politics, aka Ku Klux Klan, aka All Lives Matter, all of the things which invalidates the black experiences I'm not okay with, but I can understand where it might be stemming from and I can have compassion for where it might be stemming from. I don't have to have compassion for their politics, but I can have compassion for their trauma. In conclusion, our spiritual awareness mindful model helps regulate and bring spiritual awareness to our protective response cycles and also our healing response cycle. So in the lens of post-traumatic slave master syndrome, my hope is as I begin to further deconstruct this idea and talk to people about these ideas, that we'll be able to see and help white individuals increase their capacity to align mind, body, and spirit when confronted with racial stimuli. Increase in an awareness of social structures which reinforce privileged positions of patterns of marginalization of subjugated groups. We'll also hope to increase ability to own social position as a product of privilege derived from ingrained patterns of social organizing within a racialized society. Hope to increase also the understanding and sensitivity to the emotional realities of marginalized groups. And then lastly, increase in individuals' understanding of their own emotional triggers, which is derived from own traumatic experiences associated with race. That's it, you all. Here are the notations of where we got the information from cited in this presentation. Again, always like, subscribe, follow. I am Sir Aaron Mason, PhD candidate in marriage and family therapy at the University of Louisiana Monroe, developer of urban spirituality. So follow me on Twitter at Sir Aaron Mason. Also look for me on Facebook, other social media platforms at Sir Aaron Mason. Also like, share, and look up urban spirituality. Always email me. I'm all about collaboration and developing on ideas. So feel free to reach out and contact me. Hope you all do well. Have a blessed day and keep vibing and thriving. Love you.